pleased to have Joan with us today. Joan is interested by many fields and many research topics, but of course, including migration. So he has produced very good research in recent time, published in a very good journal like Restud, Journal of Human Resources, European Economic Review. So I think that he has produced a couple of papers on the impact of immigrants on the labor market. Today is going to talk about that, and with also the idea of assimilation of immigrants. So we are very pleased to have him on board. So I'm going to give you 45 minutes, Johan. So the rule of the games are the same as usual. So panelists can ask for clarification questions. Other people in the audience can ask questions through the chat, and Simone, as usual, will do an excellent job in sorting the questions, and also the co-authors can reply to some questions through the chat. Okay, Johan, so the floor is yours, and we are listening to you. Thank you.
So thanks very much for your kind introduction and for having me here. It's a pleasure or even an honor to present in front of all of you today. So as Michelle said, I'm going to talk about labor market assimilation of immigrants, and it's also going to be connected to labor market effects of immigration. So this is joint work with Christoph and Albrecht, and they're both in. It's easy to motivate this in this audience, but I'm going to do it anyway. So with the Syrian refugee crisis and the rise of xenophobic movements around the world, there's been a renewed interest in understanding how immigrants assimilate in the labor market. I think this is a topic that's been there for a long time, but we still don't fully understand, we think. In general, the way in which we measure immigrant assimilation, at least labor economists measure immigrant assimilation, is in terms of relative wages. So it's comparing wages of comparable immigrants and natives, and see how the wages of immigrants converge to those of natives as immigrants spend time in the US. So indeed, there is a very positive correlation between years in the US and relative wages of immigrants compared to natives. And the traditional discussion in the literature has always been about whether, the extent to which this is assimilation of immigrants, or to what extent this is driven by changes in composition effects. Okay. What we're going to talk today about is it's a different mechanism. It's a new mechanism that haven't been explored, which is labor market competition. Okay, so what we think here is that like immigrants and natives are imperfect substitutes in production, which is also a topic that's been recurrent in the wage effects of immigration literature. So then, by the changing sizes of immigrant cohorts that we observe in the data, then this means that this rate of relative convergence must be affected by labor market equilibrium effects. So I'm going to try to give you the intuition of what we're after here in this first slide. Okay, so natives and immigrants work in different occupations. Immigrants tend to downgrade at entry. So for all these reasons that have been discussed in the literature, I think we all are fine in saying that they're possibly imperfect substitutes in production. So the implication, as I said, is that if the sizes of immigrant cohorts keep growing over time, as we observe them to do in the data, then this means more competition for immigrants than for natives. Okay, and in a way, this itself, even if for a fixed level of convergence, this itself would make the relative wages to go apart as the immigrant sizes increase. So essentially, in this figure, this is an example. It's a made-up example. So you'll see here, I hope, all the intuition of what's coming next. So what I plot here is two typical simulation curves. So what we see here on the vertical axis is the relative wages of immigrants compared to natives with the same age and potentially other observables. This one is age. And then what you see, the darker line, let's say this is the cohort of 1960s, the cohort that in this example arrived with an initial gap of 18 percentage points and progressively converged to natives in the left graph, or didn't fully converge in the right graph. So in 1990s, now assume everything is the same. So the technology of assimilation haven't changed at all. So the composition of the immigrants haven't changed at all. all what changes is competition. So now in 1990s, there is more immigrants in the US. And because these immigrants are imperfect substitutes to natives, and in particular, the less simulated the immigrants are in our framework, the less perfect substitutes they're going to be with respect to natives. So then what you have is these curves, these relative wages are pushed down because immigrants are more negatively affected than natives. And on top of that, early immigrants are pushed down more than immigrants that have been already quite some time in the US because they are more imperfect substitutes to natives. Okay, and this is the pink line that you can observe here. So you can see that it's pushed down. So this is if there was a one-time increase in the immigration, okay? But then there's going to be another type of effect that is what we're going to call the dynamic competition effect, which is summarized here. So now we see that every cohort, every year, the sizes of the immigrant cohorts keep increasing, okay? So this means that this same immigrant is jumping from one line to the next in this color gradient that you see in the figure, okay? We observe is that this individual arrives here in this first dot, and he's in the first level of competition. After 10 years in the US, this is the level of competition. So he's now in this curve, not in the original one. And 10 years after, he's in this curve. So as you can see, this dynamic effect tends to reduce the speed of assimilation of immigrants, as long as, of course, the sizes of immigrant cohorts keep increasing over time as they did in the day. Okay? So those are essentially the three mechanisms, if you wish, or two, that we're going to see in our framework. Okay, so wages initial gap is going to be pushed down, and then the effect on the speed of convergence is going to be ambiguous depending on whether the first effect, this effect, dominates or this dynamic effect. So essentially our contribution is to link this imperfect substitutability between natives and immigrants and the increasing size of cohorts with immigrant assimilation with a simple production function framework that explicitly links them. So what we do is we structurally estimate the parameters of the framework, and then we do some counterfactual simulations to decompose what's the role of the competition effects, which is our new mechanism, and what's the role of composition effects driven by education, changes in the country of origin composition, and everything else that is what we're going to label under unobservable skills. Okay? So this, let me just start showing some facts. I mean, this is well known for the fractional view at the very least. So what we observe here is precisely this type of assimilation patterns like the one I just exemplified, but this is real data. So what you have in the dashed line here, this is just year by year regressions, controlling for an age polynomial and putting dummies for how many years you've been already in the US. So you can call this the raw data if you want. And then the solid lines, the curves, are the predictions from the regression that we have here at the bottom of the slide. Okay, so two kind of well-known facts here. One is that the gap between immigrants and natives have been increasing over decades, and two is the speed of convergence of immigrant wages to those of natives have been also slowing down. Okay, this, for example, Borjas was here as a panelist, so he has a couple of papers showing all those patterns. Okay, now what is maybe less known but speaks a bit of our mechanism here. So I'm going to show you here in this graph some correlations that link the initial wage gap in these kind of regressions here, and the growth rate in the first 10 years with the sizes of the immigrant cohorts that arrive in each state in the US. Okay, so what we do here is we run this same regression that we have here, state by state. Of course, we exclude those states in which there is too few people, and then we have the initial prediction of the initial wage gap. We correlate that with the size of the immigrant cohort that we're talking about. That's the left figure. Okay. So the right figure does the same thing, but instead it correlates the growth that our regressions predict for the first 10 years with the size not of the current cohort, but of the next cohort, the one that will arrive during the next 10 years. Okay. So of course, then like to avoid here just plotting the same results that just showed you in the previous graph, we net all these out of state fixed effects and calendar time fixed effects. Okay, so when we do that, what you observe here is there is a negative correlation between the size of the inflows and the initial wage gap. So in those states and periods in which we have larger inflow of immigrants, we have a larger initial wage gap at entry, in line with the predictions from our model. And then we have a positive correlation in this case of, coincidentally is of the same size but opposite sign, but this is coincidence. So a positive correlation between the growth rate in the first 10 years and the size of the next cohort. Okay. So as I said before, the effect on growth is ambiguous. So this kind of points out to an accelerating effect dominating the dynamic effect. So this is a bit of large literature. I'm not going to spend much time on this. I'm definitely not making justice here to the profession and to all of you who are here listening. I'm sure that many of your papers should be here and they're not, but there's not much more space in this slide. So we're essentially talking to 4 literatures here. And we're talking about, if you want, 2 literatures of immigrant assimilation. There is a literature looking at the US, which is very, very big. There is also a growing literature looking at other countries. So we contribute to this literature for obvious reasons. Then our paper is also connected to the wage effects of immigration in terms of all this discussion that I said of immigrants adding more competition to other immigrants than to natives. And more broadly is connected to those papers and many others that we have here that analyze just wage dynamics, not related to immigration, mostly related to increasing wage inequality, that do similar to what we do. They use production function frameworks to essentially decompose observed changes in, for example, high school wage gap and other type of inequality into different mechanisms. Okay, so let me go straight to the model. It's a very simple model, so it's easy to explain. So we're going to have here 2 types of imperfectly substitutable skills. There's going to be general skills, and I don't know, nailing, for example. It's the same thing, nailing in the US and in Mexico. And then there is US specific skills. You can think of these as English, for example, or business culture of the US, whatever you want. Okay. So observational equivalent natives and immigrants, they have exactly the same amount of general skills. Observational equivalent here means same education, same potential experience. Okay. But then immigrants arrive in the US with only a fraction of specific skills. And then as they spend time in the US, they accumulate specific skills. Let's say they learn English if you want, and then eventually converge or not to the specific skills that native have. Okay, there's no investment decisions here, so the accumulation of skill happens in a mechanical way, and then workers that pay the marginal product. Okay, so here output is produced according to this very simple production function. So everything here that's not general or specific skills is in this AT, which is the TFP type of term. Also capital is embedded there. Everything is embedded there. So, so what we have here is general and specific skills, and they are potentially imperfect substitutes in production. Okay, so if sigma is not infinite, then they are imperfectly substitutable in production. So you need to nail and you need to talk, okay, to be able to produce. And then the marginal product is those expressions you have at the bottom of the slide, which essentially mean that when you compute the relative prices of general versus specific skill units, what you have is that this ratio depends on G over S or S over G and sigma. Okay, so essentially the relative sizes of general versus specific skills, the relative supplies of those skills, and how imperfectly substitutable they are, this will determine the relative prices. So if sigma is infinite, then they are perfect substitutes, then the relative prices are going to be constant and unaffected by the amount of skills we have in the economy. But if not, they will. And because immigrants over proportionately supply general skills, because they supply same units as natives, but fewer of specific, so then increasing the stock of immigrants in the economy, what it does is it increases the relative supply of general skills, and therefore it reduces the relative price of general skill relative to specific skill. So then the way in which immigrants accumulate specific skill is given by this production function here, this function S. Okay, so I didn't say that, both general and specific skills, they're all shifted by some index of general skills, with this H of EX that I'm going to show you in the next slide. So then this S is equal to 1 for natives, and it's equal to a number that's going to be typically smaller than 1 for immigrants, okay? And this number smaller than 1 depends on origin country O. Oh, here we changed notation, and I forgot to change in the slide. So ignore the K and J thing here. Origin country is O, not K. Education group is E, so we have 4 education groups here. High school dropouts, graduates, some college and college. Then the potential experience with which the immigrants arrive in the US, or the age of entry if you want, and the cohort in which the immigrants arrive. And each of those types of inputs, they affect not only they not only shift the curve in a parallel manner, these are theta 1, 3, and 6, but they also shift the speed at which S converges to those of natives. So they all affect the way in which the years in the US, which is this Y, affects S, okay? And the way in which immigrants accumulate S over time is, as I said, mechanical, just by spending time in the US, by Y increasing over time, okay? So then this is the general index of skills shifter, so this H of EX. This is essentially a period-specific Minserian type of return. So there's some return to education level, and to a polynomial of experience. And then wages are essentially the product of prices of general skill units times the number of general skill units an individual produces, plus the price of the specific skill units times the number of specific skill units that an individual produces, which is S times H. Okay, again, S is 1 for natives, a fraction for immigrants. Okay, so then the relative wages of an immigrant compared to the equivalent native, meaning the native with the same education and experience, is given by this expression over here. Okay, and once you divide everything by RGT, you can get this expression here at the bottom. So what we have here essentially is the ratio of 1 plus S relative prices, 1 plus relative prices. Now you can see that, for example, if S is equal to 1, then this ratio is 1. So if S is equal to 1, then immigrants are the same as natives, so wages are totally converged. If sigma is infinite, then this ratio is equal to 1. So then there is only a mapping between S and relative wages that doesn't change with the inflow of the immigrant. Okay? So those are essentially how the different mechanisms operate. So therefore, not only this production framework shows some imperfect substitutability between general and specific skills, it also, as a result, generates an imperfect degree of substitutability between natives and immigrants. And I'm going to show you some numbers of that later. It also features downgrading at entry, like pointed out by those co-authors, because S is normally smaller than 1 at arrival. And it also embeds as a special case the traditional assimilation regressions. And this is the special case when sigma is equal to infinite. So when sigma is equal to infinite, this wage equation over here, you can write it as this log linear regression here. That is what normally has been estimated, for example, in all the papers by George. So that's essentially the modeling framework. As I said, very simple framework. It's also very simple to estimate. Okay, we're going to estimate this in 2 steps. So the first step, we take the sample of natives, and for that, we estimate a Minserian type of regression year by year. Okay, census year by census year, because here all these parameters are period specific. And then we include a bunch of markets period dummies. Okay, markets for us are going to be states. So we're going to assume that every state in the US, they produce with a production function similar to the one that I just showed. Okay, and then those state time dummies will capture the aggregation of the relative skill prices. Because remember, in this wage regression over here, natives have S equal to 1. So therefore, you have the sum of the skill prices times H. When you take logs, this sum is embedded into this dummy. Okay? Then in the second stage, so once we have the H index, then we can predict what natives equivalent to each immigrant in our sample would earn. Okay, and that's this term that we subtract here on the left-hand side. And then this term would correspond to this ratio over here, okay? And then we take logs to this, the right-hand side term is the log of this expression we have here, in which I substitute already s by its function. And here, we introduce here these parameters to reflect the fact that these aggregate skills depend on parameter bound, okay? So therefore, this is a nonlinear regression. You add, again, like we did here, some measurement error to it. You can estimate this by nonlinear least squares. So again, it's relatively simple to do. Census samples are big, so it takes some time, but not a horrendous amount of time. We use census data. We clean it in the very standard way, so I'm not going to spend time on it. And also, I'm not going to spend that much time on the parameter estimates itself, because I want to spend most of the remaining time in the company.
I have a very simple question, Juan. Do you allow for different business cycle effects, and doesn't potentially matter? So is that so all that's incorporated right now is cohort size effects in a sense, or competition effects, whatever you want to call it. But that I also could think of if the business cycle effects are stronger for natives than immigrants.
I mean, this is every 10 years. So business cycle, I'm not really sure that's the right word to talk about this. We do allow for kind of changing demand type of effects in two ways, okay? In our baseline specification, this is included in this index of skills. Every census year, the returns to skills change. So for example, skill bias technical change pay more to highly educated people over time. This is included, okay? So then there could be something else as well, which is over time, there are some changes that not only affect general supply of skills, but also affect the relative demand of general versus specific skills. For example, because technological progress can make language type of jobs more appealing than manual jobs, and language type of jobs have more specific skills than manual jobs, okay? So if that happens, then you would need to have, like essentially here, a delta T multiplying in this production function. We do that in our robustness checks. I'll show them quickly at the end. Essentially, this doesn't change anything.
Okay. And you just have four, so you have 4 decades, is what you're looking at in the.
This is because this is census data. So like that's competition wise, this is what we have. Yes, George.
It's about the period effects. There's 2 kinds of period effects. One is economy-wide business cycle kind of thing, like we were talking about before, right? The other is it may well be there are supply shocks in particular periods that create economy-wide, consequences. Does it matter for what you're doing whether the period effect is something that has nothing to do with supply or something that has to do with supply?
So when you say something has to do with supply, for example, are you thinking about networks?
A huge Marielle one year that affects the economy, and it's a period effect for that year or something, and it can last for several years. But that's a little different than a period effect that is just because the macroeconomy,
So this is exactly what our mechanism is about. So if there is a Marielle, and then somehow this is absorbed in the economy, what it means in our model is that this Marielle is initially pushing a lot the relative wages of general versus specific skills, because there's all these new workers that have lots of general skills compared to very few specific skills. And then over time, as they assimilate, like this shock would fade down, okay? There could be something else to that, and I also want to talk about this later in the robustness checks, which is, with these supply shocks, what can happen is that then suddenly you have more people, for example, from your country of origin, and therefore you talk more Spanish and you don't talk that much English and you don't learn that. So on those things, we also do a robustness check, which I will show you at the end, hopefully if I have time. Okay. So going back to what we have here, like I said, the returns, to experience and education are kind of in the literature. It is very, very heterogeneous patterns of assimilation here in terms of origin, country, education, or the model fits data quite well. Then in terms of imperfect substitutability, which is here, as I explained before, key for the mechanism to occur. This one, maybe I'll show you. So I hope this is not too small on your screens. So here in the top panel, what we have is our estimate for sigma. This is 0.021, whatever that is. It is hard to interpret this number per se, because we don't know exactly, what's the measure of general skill and specific skill units. But one thing that we can do, And we derive a formula for it, which is something like this. Okay, I'm not going to spend time explaining it. So you can compute what the implied elasticity of substitution between natives and immigrants would be in the data predicted with our model. And that number will be 29, which is a number that fits, for example, very much into the ballpark of the estimates that Ottaviano and Perry find in their paper, or for example, the estimates that my restart paper I generate with endogenous occupation decisions by immigrants and natives. Okay, and then the third panel, what it does is to compute the elasticities of substitution across different groups of individuals, because some different immigrants of different maturity, if you want, with natives, and then also with other immigrants with different years in the US. And what you can see here is that newly arrived immigrants and natives, they are very imperfect substitutes here, whereas immigrants that have been more than 30 years in the US, they're essentially perfect substitutes to natives, okay? And also, as you compare them with immigrants, also you have all this gradient of imperfect substitutability. So that's all I'm going to say about estimates. I'm going to jump straight to counterfactuals in the last 17 minutes that we have. So first, let me give you a sense of how big the competition shock, the supply shock has been. Okay, so in this graph here, in the left panel, what we have is how the immigrant supplies of general skill units and specific skill units have changed over time. So as you can see, there is a massive increase of general and specific skill units supplied by immigrants. But of course, because immigrants supply less specific skills than natives, so then there's been a higher increase in general skill units than in specific skill units. So these maps into changes in relative skill prices. So this line over here, which you have to read in these axes. So this is the relative price of general versus specific skills. Okay, and as you can see, this relative price in 1970 was something like 0.87%. Sorry, 87%. And in 2010, this goes down to only 27%. So it's really a huge change in the relative prices of skills, which could explain, as I'm going to show you later, a big fraction of the patterns I showed at the beginning. So what you have in the right-hand side graph here is to give you a little bit of a sense of how different is this increasing competition in different states. Okay, what we do is to compute the relative skill prices for different states in the US in each period. Okay, so the different patterns here mean periods, and the letters identify the states. As you can see, most of the states are at relative prices equal to close to 1 in 1970s, and then like this variation starts to occur in years after. So you can see here, for example, California, New York, Florida. So all those countries experience a huge change in the relative prices, whereas other countries like those classes here, which I don't see what states they are. So those didn't change that much. So and this variation helps us in identifying what's going on with the elasticity of substitution. Okay. So therefore, with these supply shocks and with the estimates that I briefly mentioned before, so we do two types of exercise. There's tons of graphs and tables in the paper. I'm not going to be able to go over all of them in this short period of time. They're in the paper if you want to check them. But we essentially do two types of exercise. First, we do an exercise in which we take some baseline individual, and then we only change one thing at a time for this individual to understand how the different forces in our model operate. Okay, so this baseline individual is kind of a very usual suspect. It's a Mexican high school dropout who arrived in the US in 1970s cohort, except when we changed the cohort, which is what I'm going to show you now, with 10 years of potential experience at arrival. Okay, and then with that, we compute what happens if you remove the competition effect for this individual. So if you remove it kind of on a one-time increase type of way, and also if you do it with a dynamic mechanism that I explained before, okay? So the graphs are there, I'm not going to show them. So then we do a composition analysis. So we change the distribution of education first and of origin country next, holding constant this type of individual, but like we change in the way in which we observe it changing in the data, those distributions. And then we check what's left after that. Okay, so how the unobservable changed. So how the selection changed, for example, for those immigrants over time. So this one I'm going to show you in a second. The others not because of time constraints, unfortunately, but they are in the paper. And then the second type of exercise we do is we simulate wages for different quantifiable scenarios for every immigrant in the sample, for every individual in the sample. So natives, they don't change, immigrants, they do. So, and then we again compute this simulation type of regressions that I showed in the very first figure before. Okay, and this way we see in practice how much of the observed patterns are driven by the composition effect, by competition effect, and by other factors. Okay, so in terms of like what's the end of this in terms of unobservable skills. So here I'm going to show you a picture that is kind of radically different to what I would say is the common result in the literature. Okay, so what you observe here is that, again, this Mexican high school dropout, 10 years of experience at arrival immigrant. So if he arrived in 1960s, so he would be this dark line over here. Okay, then 1970s would be this less dark line, 1980s and 1990s. Okay, so these first two graphs, they're the same idea as the first graph I showed you before, and then the third graph is the difference relative to the 1960s cohort. Okay, so what you observe here is that indeed, contrary to what we normally have observed in the literature, so those cohorts are more positively selected over time. So the initial wage gap is not wider, but it's less wide than before. Okay, so the initial gap for the guys arriving in the 1960s, so it was 34%, then 28, 24, and then 14. Okay, and then as a result of that, so the speed of assimilation is being slower. So if you think about this, the result kind of makes sense in the following terms. So think about English as an example. Okay, so with globalization and also with more Mexicans, for example, having family members in the U.S., TV, whatever you want. So those Mexicans tend to know more English by the time they arrive in the U.S. So this would be reflected in this initial gap reduction. Okay, but then of course, because there is decreasing returns to the accumulation of skills, so then their convergence pattern is slower. So at the end, the guys like this essentially tend to, more or less converge to the wages of natives up to a 5 or 6% differential. Okay, so that would be kind of the first main takeaway. So the second thing I'm going to show you is this the composition exercise I told you before. Okay, so what you observe now in 4 graphs is what we had in the very first figure in 1 graph. It's the 4 lines that we had before. Well, except these ones are predicted from our model, but they are essentially identical to those that we estimated in the data first. Okay, so that would be kind of our baseline gap. There was no competition effect. In other words, sigma was equal to infinite, and therefore relative skill prices would always equal to. Okay, so that's what would happen. So what you see is, well, already 1960s there's a little bit of push up, but not much. And then 1970s cohort is kind of horizontally pushed up by about 6-7 percentage points. 1980s cohort is pushed up more at the beginning than at the end, meaning that like the first type of effect, the increasing convergence type of speed of convergence type of effect would dominate, but then you see almost no convergence whatsoever. And the 1990s cohort, again, pretty much no convergence, but again, it's pushed up in a relatively horizontal manner. Okay, so then second thing that we add to this is to say, well, now let's hold the education and origin country distribution constant to the 1960s cohort. Okay, so when we do that, of course, the 1960s line is going to be, exactly on top of the others by construction, because that one is unchanged. And then the others, we kept origin and education constant to 1960. So what you can see here is that these accounts for a little bit of the gap, not as much as the competition effect. Okay, but you see the lines that are a bit closer to natives. But now, if you look at these pictures, so what is left after you take out education, origin, and competition effect is that, the initial wage gap is kind of out. So you don't see an increase in the initial wage gap. You also see a decrease. And I can say, I don't see how this figure matches the previous figure I showed you, okay? And to some extent, we didn't do at the beginning as well. But then it turns out that there is something else here. That is, we're holding education of immigrants constant to 1960s, but the education of natives has increased a lot over these years, okay? So actually, by holding constant the education of immigrants, we're making immigrants systematically less and less educated than natives, okay? So what we do next is another counterfactual in which, again, we remove competition effects. And on top of that, we make the education of immigrants to grow at the same speed that we observe the education of natives grow over these years. So when you do that, this is what you get, okay? So essentially what you get is that, well, 1970s cohort's pretty much the same as the 1960s cohort. Maybe it converges a little bit faster. And then 1980s and 1990s cohort, this is pretty much, it's flat, but it's pretty much converged from minute one, if you want, okay? So again, this would mean that there are two main mechanisms that seem to be explaining the patterns I showed you at the beginning. So one is the competition effect that would account for roughly 1/3 of this. Two is the diverging level of education of immigrants, of new cohorts of immigrants relative to those of natives, okay? Once you actually net out this, as I showed you in the previous picture, then the unobservables seem to point into the positive selection direction.
Sorry, Joan?
Yes?
One question. So how does the negative trend for the 90s cohort correspond to the raw data, or say the empirical evidence out there?
So this is exactly as in raw data. You mean this decreasing thing?
Yes.
This you observe in the raw data already. Okay. So why that happens? Well, it seems that this, the wages of this cohort didn't grow.
But the axes are completely different, right? So no.
No, the axes are exactly the same. This axis is exactly the same as in the other figure. So what I show you in that figure is these 4 lines, one in each graph. Okay.
Okay.
Good. So let me use the last couple of minutes to mention the robustness checks that we do. Okay. So essentially, this is the main message already from the paper. So if we had to stop here, we would already be good. So we're doing fine. It's 4 minutes to go. So now the last thing that we do is we do a bunch of robustness checks. We check a couple of things. Some of them already discussed in reaction to the comments by Steve and George. So we check 3 things mainly. One is we check for network effects. One could argue that, well, more Mexicans are coming to the US, and this makes, in the states where more Mexicans are coming, this makes the network of Mexicans bigger. And as a result of that, what we observe is that maybe Mexicans don't need to learn English anymore because they can communicate between themselves. They can work in their own, firms, and then they can form forms of ghettos, for example. Okay. Then we would be attributing to changes in equilibrium prices something that is due to this network effect. Okay. So one thing that we do is we allow 2 types of network variables to enter into our speed of assimilation, our S function. Okay, our specific scale units. So we allow, in one specification, we take the stock of immigrants from your country of origin in your state. The other one is the share of immigrants from your country of origin in your state. Okay, and in both cases, we allow this to enter both linearly and interacted with years in the US. Okay, so therefore, this somehow controls for this potential network effect. So the second type of exercises that we do 3 different exercises taking into account the demand effects that Steve was worried about. Okay, so as I said before, so we introduced this delta T here, and this delta T essentially what it does is to capture a possible change in the relative demand for specific scale units, for example, driven by scale bias technical change. Okay, so we have 3 different specifications of this delta T, all of them enter into an exponential. We have a linear trend, a quadratic trend, or simple time dummies. Okay, The key for identification here is that all these trends or dummies, they're common across the states. Okay, so we say that technology here in the US is flows completely across the states. So therefore, this compared to the variation across the states still allow us to identify these delta T and sigma separately. Okay. And the third type of robustness checks that we do is we allow for different definitions of the labor market in terms of where competition takes place. Okay. So we define labor markets as census divisions, for example, which are bigger than states, or we define labor markets as state education groups, assuming that people in different education groups don't compete with each other, okay? Which this we can also do. And we re-estimate again everything. And with all these re-estimates, and here I don't have time to go on this table, we have some key parameters you can see in the paper. But then what we do is we do the same decomposition I just showed you now, okay? And this is the result. So what we have here, so the colored lines are exactly the same lines I showed you before. And then the gray lines are each of the 7 alternative specifications I just described, okay? So we didn't bother labeling them here just because the point for this figure is not to identify them separately, just to see that indeed each of these lines is very close to the main specification one, meaning that our results are very robust to all these issues I just mentioned before, okay? So because we're exactly on time, I think I'm going to conclude here.
Yes, indeed. Very good job.
So I'm gonna just summarize here what I said very quickly. So what we do here is we explore the role of labor market competition in explaining the observed patterns of wage assimilation that we've seen in the US in the recent decades. We provide a very simple framework based on a production function to analyze it. We estimate structurally the parameters of this function, and we use it to simulate counterfactuals. We show that indeed the competition effect seems to account for about 1/3 of the increasing gap with natives, whereas the diverging education seems to account for roughly 2/3. It is a large contribution into the widening of the initial wage gap that we observe in the raw data. But then it has a positive effect on the speed of convergence, the competition effect. Okay, so which means that this initial channel I was mentioning at the beginning seems to dominate in practice. And finally, so we observed that the recently arrived immigrants seem to have higher and not lower amounts of unobservable skills, for example, English. This could be driven by increasing globalization, we speculate. And hence they have a smaller initial wage gap, but then they converge at a slower rate in consequence. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I think Sandra had a question.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. So I had a couple of questions that may worry me about how they bias your competition effect, and they are both correlated with illegal immigration and outflow. So to what extent does your model or your data capture illegal immigration, the size and the change of this inflow of migrants, and then outflows, right? But specifically deportations, the same thing. They might be shrinking your competition, right? And to what extent can we kind of control for that in your estimate?
So this is census data. So, this is not perfect. We know census data underestimates undocumented migrants by an important extent. But I also would say in terms of microdata, this is the best. So there's not much more we can do about it. We can speculate what would happen. So what would happen, in my opinion, is that these undocumented immigrants, they tend to be mostly low educated. So in our model, they would tend to increase the supply of general skills relative to specific skills even more. So they would generate a bit more of competition effect. That would be my speculation. Now, the other point that you made, which is very important, is return migration. Again, this is another point in which we are very constrained by the data. Okay, so there are very nice papers out there that I cited at the beginning that indeed, Darren Lubowski's paper, for example, there are some others. So what they do is they use some form of longitudinal data to essentially trim out all those immigrants who return home, to avoid that, if there is negative selection in return migration, this is shaping the results. Again, census data is cross-sectional data, so there is not that much that we can do. But in a way here, I guess that what that would do to our results is that indeed we would observe even more positive select immigrants if we were able to eliminate that out of the picture.
Okay, thank you, Joan. I think that your last point was raised during the chat by Toman. So Toman, did Joan address your question, or do you want to add something about that, about the migration?
Maybe just to add a bit. No, I fully understand that, you know, census data doesn't really allow you to control for return migration. But I was wondering whether you could look at just the relative sizes of different cohorts over time. I mean, you know, the characteristics in census year 1 of different cohorts and the size, right? You can see whether, you know, the same or a similar amount of migrants show up 10 years later down the road.
Yes, we actually did that. Oh, sorry. Go on.
It would be interesting to just get a better understanding whether, you know, it's the ones with more or less specific skills who out-migrate, just to make this point you just made to in which direction the bias goes. And the second and kind of like related point is internal migration within the United States. So could it be that different types of migrants are more or less likely to move within the United States? So say you have more specific or maybe less specific skills, I'm not sure which direction this goes, and then you like kind of move away to different labor markets within the United States. If anything to say about that.
Yeah, so okay, thanks. So those are two very good points. So the first thing that you suggest, actually we did that. The problem is that, as I was saying before, we know that census undercounts undocumented immigrants. And especially here in the 1986, there was this IRCA reform. And essentially what you observe besides is that you have, I mean, you see the sizes of cohorts in the census is to actually grow instead of, I mean, you keep one cohort over, you see it predicted to be growing instead of reducing, which is sort of a bit annoying because this means there's something weird in the data. So the bottom line is that this type of exercise includes two types of things. It includes, on the one hand, the undocumented. I mean, actually, it includes the two things that Sandra pointed out. It includes the undocumented immigration, so those more undocumented migrants kind of show up in the data. And on the other hand, there are the return migrants that are not there anymore. So like it's something we actually thought about exactly this thing, and we tried, but it was a bit unsatisfactory for this reason. So in terms of the internal mobility within the US. So, I mean, in principle here, I mean, what we observe in every year is just a snapshot. I mean, we have the section we observe here in a given market at a given point in time, and we observe the competition that there is around you. So in that sense, I mean, there's nothing wrong about this. This doesn't generate nothing wrong, if you want, in our kind of estimation. However, like if you think in terms of, for example, arbitraging out differences or native migrating out, arbitraging out differences across states and so on. I mean, again, the different aggregations that I showed you before, giving the same result is kind of reassuring in that sense, in the sense of not being very worried about this issue.
Okay, we have still some time for more questions. So there was one question from Llull. So Llull, please go ahead.
Yes. So no, it seems a lot depends on your classification of skills into general and specific skills. How really critical is this, and where does the classification comes? Is it something that is established? For example, you say English is a specific skill, which we used to think about specific skills as being specific to the firm or to the industry. So really, did you check the sensitivity of your classification of the results to classifying skills into specific or in general?
Yeah, so maybe that's not clear enough. So we don't really classify skills in the ONET type of fashion in terms of general and specific. I mean, we acknowledge we don't observe skills. So we interpret our wage data as a function of a composition of general and specific skill, okay? So, and in principle, like the way in which we identify these two groups of skills essentially is by assuming out that natives, I mean, to normalize, if you will, not assume, that natives have the maximum amount of skills you can supply, of general and specific skills, and then the immigrants have a fraction of that. Then it's only the wages who speaks about that. We don't really classify, we don't use other information or occupation to tell, like this immigrant have this or that amount of skill.
Okay, we have still 3 questions from Dean, from George, and from Stephen. So Dean, maybe your question, please.
Yeah. Joan, very nice paper. The conclusion is very striking. 1/3 of, the competition effect explaining 1/3 of the wage gap. I mean, that's very striking. I wonder if could you comment on how that estimate might change if you consider the possibility that you're not fully getting the identification perfect? And what I'm imagining that actually sort of my gut feeling is that actually the estimate of the role of the competition effect could actually even be larger if you're not fully, in other words, your point I think becomes even more important if you're not really fully controlling for labor demand shocks. The best case for your situation in terms of identification right now is that if you really have exogenous immigration flows, so you can really in essence trace out the labor demand curve for immigrant labor. But and then that gets, then you have to worry about bias if in fact you're not in that situation and you actually have labor demand shifting around as well. My gut feeling is that would actually attenuate your estimate of the role of the competition effect, and which actually makes your point even more important. That to the extent that your identification is imperfect, this phenomenon is even more important. So in some sense, your estimates are a lower bound of the true important competition effect. Can you comment?
Yeah. So I think you touched on 2 very important issues here. I mean, the demand effects is same thing I said before. For example, to see if this robustness check kind of controls for those shocks, and I think results are very robust to that. But then another thing that you point out is the possible endogeneity of of which states have more immigrants in them and so on and so forth. This is a robustness check that I was hoping that we could have for today, but we didn't manage to yet. I mean, but we have. So we essentially what we're going to do is we're going to try to see with some of the whatever instruments that have been used in the literature, for example. We can estimate using GMM, the same expression than before, but just using this exogenous variation or exogenous variation, if you don't believe that much the instruments, how that affects the relative supplies of skills. So we're going to try that. I mean, I have no idea whether this is going to work or not. So maybe I shouldn't advertise it too much. But this is something we've thought about, but we haven't had time to.
But I guess my gut feeling is that actually you can make an argument that your estimates are a lower bound of the true effect.
It's exactly the way.
That, or do you think do you agree with that, or is it more ambiguous?
This is exactly the way in which we think about it. Yes, this is exactly the way. So if we are kind of underestimating the wage effect of immigration, if you want, due to the standard arguments in the wage impacts literature, then we are underestimating our competition effect.
Yeah.
Yes. You're totally right.
I would like to give George and Stephen the chance to raise their question. So George, please.
Okay, so this is a really nice paper, Joan. It's a really nice synthesis of 2 very different literatures on immigration, right? And it's important to do. If you can turn to figure 10, I have a question about a bigger sort of kind of question about figure 10 and what it really means. What's really plagued this literature throughout is that we only observe earnings, and earnings can be affected by all kinds of stuff, right? Cohort effects, period effects, what you call composition effects. So that tracing earnings over time for natives and immigrants doesn't really tell you what assimilation is about for any of those reasons, right? And what you really want, if you could have ideal data, would be the human capital stock of immigrants and of natives, and you will graph the human capital stock of the 2 groups in a graph like that, and that would be the truth, right? And that would be, presumably, that's what I was looking for when I control for cohort effects. That's what you're looking for when you control for composition effects, right? A measure of the true human capital stock and how these 2 things are converging over time, right? All right, so now you put a whole bunch of structure on this. And as you know, structure implies assumptions, and assumptions imply restrictions. And at the end, I look at figure 10 and I'm trying to figure out, is this really human capital stock trends? Or is it really just something that was built in by the assumptions? So what I think is really important to people at this point is to take these graphs and try, like, for example, we know something, like, unfortunately, you control for education and stuff like that, right? But suppose you hadn't control for education. You could look at this intercepts, and that tells you something about cohort effects after you control for everything, right? Is there any way that you can look at these intercepts and correlate them with something we observe about the actual human capital they provide? In other words, are these intercepts you're getting a fiction due to the structure, or do they really reflect something that you could actually prove with real data? Same thing with English. You sort of put English on the side and you bring it in and out. I think actually you can exploit that, okay? You get these paths, right? These paths presumably measure human capital increases, right? English is a human capital increase. What I would do is to say, oh, you look at all these paths, do they really reflect what is happening in some kind of observable human capital like English acquisition? Or is it just a fiction of the structure? In other words, I would try to look at the graphs you're getting and try to search for some observable way of measuring human capital that you can then correlate with these things and convince people like me, for example, who's skeptical of structure because I know how much is built in, that in fact what you're capturing is the human capital stock trends as opposed to assumptions.
No, this is a great suggestion. I think there is, I'm not sure there is some information of English in the census data. I mean, if there is, that would be great. It's a great suggestion. It's something we could do. I mean, something that you do observe in the raw data is this figure I just put, this figure 2. So this is raw data. Okay, this is not built in the structure. But what you see here in the correlations already points exactly in the direction that our results show. Okay, so what you observe here is this negative correlation between the initial wage gap and the sizes of cohorts, and this positive correlation between the subsequent growth and size of cohorts. Of course, then you can go, I mean, yeah, totally I cannot do anything else and agree that then you can go and take model predictions like these curves, for example. I mean, the results of these curves and correlate them with English or with other measures that we could have in the data. I'm not sure how much we have in the data, but that's definitely a great suggestion.
Okay, we are still already over time, but I wanted to give Stephen the possibility of asking.
You still give me the chance to ask the last question?
Yes.
Well, I mean, it's very closely related to George's question and Toman's question. I mean, I was going to ask you, don't answer my first part of the question. I mean, I was going to ask you kind of where discrimination against different groups would fit into your model. I think it gets picked up in the composition effects, probably in some sense. Like if there was, say, more wage discrimination against Mexicans when they first arrive relative to more skilled migrants. But actually, the thing I was going to say, the one thing you have in the census that's very powerful to do the kind of questions, probably partially to answer as best as you can answer mine and George's, is the country of origin stuff. I mean, Albrecht answered somebody's question online saying that you had looked a little bit at this. But for example, I don't know if you allow the decomposition effects to differ by country of origin, and then try and correlate that with stuff that you know, like the language distance from English, like the stuff that Ingo Isverhering has done. I mean, I've done this a little bit for New Zealand, and we actually get pretty strong results where, I mean, the assimilation profiles are worse for groups that are further away from English, for example. And also we looked at genetic differences. I don't want to use that term very, very lightly, but, you know, looking how far people are from kind of in these people who have looked at genetic differences, which might be a measure of discrimination. I mean, you have to, my paper's unpublished, so I don't want to go too far on it, but I'm just thinking that you could maybe it's the only way you can answer George's question and my question about discrimination is by trying to say something about different groups, you know, and that the profiles look different for English language speakers than they do for non-English language speakers.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for this question / comment. Yes, no, I mean, totally right. So in terms of country of origin, I mean, first of all, like trying control for education, control for country of origin is a little bit of the reason why what we're trying to do. I mean, essentially we're trying to control for, I mean, the typical stuff that we observe in the data and then call the unobservable everything else. No? So in terms of our predictions for this same type of baseline person, but different countries of origin, Okay, this is what we have here. This first figure that I'm showing here. I mean, this is not wages, okay? This is S. And here it can be a bit misleading because you can see that most of it is above 1. This is mostly driven by, I'm simulating a high school dropout, which is this guy, and then the high school graduates are much below. So these lines would be pushed down here. What you can see here is that Holland constant indication, Holland constant, that there are important differences across countries in terms of, like specific skills. So that'll be there. And in terms of the discrimination patterns, I think to the extent, I mean, if you think, for example, this has changed over time.
Won't it matter for the composition? Like, imagine that I interpret your figure on the left by origin as saying that Western migrants aren't discriminated against and everybody else is, and we get less Western migrants over time relative to other groups. Won't that will affect you, won't it?
Yeah, well, in that case, so if the level of discrimination is something is completely constant over time, I mean, we're calling here scale differences, something that's really, like this discrimination. I mean, if this doesn't vary by years you've been in the US, it doesn't vary by, it only varies, for example, by country of origin, then maybe some of these gaps over here, they're just discrimination and not really skill differences.
Okay, guys, it's very interesting, but we need to stop here because we are still over time. I'm going to give the floor to Simone, maybe for a quick conclusion and maybe some announcement for the next seminar. Simone?
Thanks, Michel. So next seminar is next week from Petra Moser from NYU. Then we will close before the summer break with Schaller, one of the organizers from the bank, and we will resume early in September. So you will get more information via the mailing list and on our website. So thank to Joan and to all of you for having been online with us today. And
thank you very much to all of you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for having me.